Hello and welcome. My name is Ryan, and I'm going to be the host for this TLC session. We're excited that you're joining us here today for African Americans in Higher Education, Understanding the Significance of Cultural Identity in Media. Please welcome our presenter, TaNeisha Page.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for coming. It's always nerve-wracking when you have something you don't know who's going to show up, so it's nice to see that there's actually people here and eager to hear a little bit about what I've been researching and hopefully what should be published fairly soon. So before I get into my topic, I thought it was important to really have, the common theme slide of kind of, why we're here. I didn't want to be generic and just list bullet points. I thought it would be great to share a little bit more about myself and kind of what got me to this point and why I'm so interested and passionate about this topic. And so just a little bit about me. I graduated in 2015 with my PhD in adult community and professional education. Before getting my degree and actually enrolling in school, I always had a question of who I was, where I came from, what is really, making me who I am, who are my parents, who is my family, just like this whole kind of, you call it an identity crisis of just trying to figure out my way through the world. And so through my PhD program, I was actually able to provide an answer for myself and kind of start to figure out what I was passionate about and what mattered the most. And one of the things that mattered the most to me was understanding how other people see themselves and kind of where I fall in that. And so that prompted me to take it a step further and actually start researching who's talking about, African Americans, who's researching them, who's writing about them, why does it matter, and where do I fit into this? And so that is what prompted me to go down this journey. I think here recently, obviously with the political climate, everything changed a little bit because I feel like more people are having these conversations. But sometimes I don't always believe that the right people are having the conversations because the right people to have the conversation sometimes don't know how to have the conversation. And so there's this whole, bridge of who we are and how do we mold together. And so that's what prompted my research. I got contacted by a dean at the University of Houston, and he basically was like, I have a friend of a friend of a friend that sat on your dissertation chair. I want to kind of talk to you. And so we started talking. He has a contract with the book, and so he was like, I really want to get some of your work in the book. So that's where this started. Everything I'm going to present and share is actually coming from a specific article that I wrote. And so the article really is about, African Americans in higher education. We always hear about it. We always, hear about like they're different, they're this, we have to do this. But I feel like a lot of people don't actually know what it means and why we could be perceived as different or why we have certain kind of struggles. So that is what led me to go down this journey of actually providing the context of the why. And so as I go through this, just kind of keep in mind that a lot of this information in the article really just talks about the transformation of going through school and kind of the perspective of what it's like being an African American and how certain things can impact you. And I think especially at Ashford, being an African American professor at Ashford, I think that even comes with like a different type of way to make sure that I'm carrying myself the correct way, I'm modeling the correct behaviors, and I'm acknowledging that these kind of things exist too. So anyways, that's kind of my overview and spill. As we kind of get started, one of the biggest pieces of the article, and to be honest, one of the conversation starters I used to actually be able to present this information to the person who reached out to me was providing some historical context. So I think collectively as human beings, majority of us will admit that slavery actually happened and slavery did create some type of racial hierarchy. Depending on who you are, depending on where you fall on issues, I think this racial hierarchy actually is what dictates a lot of behaviors because it's something that's embedded in us. And it's just something that has happened to us in life. Some of us were alive to see it. Some of us were not. Some of us, like myself, my great-grandma is still alive. My two grandparents are still alive. I have great aunts that are still living. So I actually hear their stories quite often about, what they went through, how their mom actually, you know, overcame slavery. So all of those things still impact my identity and where I come from. So I think it's very important that we don't act like it's something that just because it's history, it doesn't impact people, when in reality it still does. And then obviously the bigger thing is leadership roles. I think the best example for this is a president. It took us, I think, 43 presidents to get somebody of diversity to be a president. And I think just realizing being, you know, an African American in this country, what impact that actually has, you know, on me. Now, obviously I'm an adult. I can, you know, I see things differently and I understand them differently. But I have a 16-year-old sister, and she lives in a world where she's forming who she is right now. And all she knows of the world is if she does everything she's supposed to be, she can be president one day. I didn't have that growing up. So I think just that little bit of context creates a different dynamic, because at the same time, she also doesn't understand why some of the things that are happening in the world, because for her first reality of life was, oh, like I can do anything. So even just like between my sister and I, we see things completely different. And I think that brings a different dynamic. So understanding those dynamics, I think, is very important as well. I think personally, one of the more controversial topics that I often go back and forth with, actually with my groups of friends, and I actually have this conversation very regularly with my boss at work, is distinguishing cultures. So when I say Black culture, I think of things like music, dancing, clothing, big chains, all the things that on the outside people just see as Black people being. And so that creates a certain type of framework that you see a certain group of people if that's the, you know, the way that you see them. The dominant culture being the culture that's always in, you know, leadership roles and power and positions. And I think the biggest thing to point out here is the dominant culture is always setting the tone. And I think they're setting the standard. So if the standard is so high that somebody thinks that they can't reach it, or if somebody sets the standard so high that they feel like somebody else below them has to work so hard to get to that standard, it creates a different dynamic, and it creates, you know, a challenge. I think that goes back to the racial hierarchy that I mentioned before. And then the African American culture is the culture of slavery, and is the culture of oppression, and is the culture of trying to overcome and constantly, you know, trying to reach a point of, you know, you want to shed that culture, but you don't want to shed that culture because that's who you are. And I think for me, myself personally, the African American culture was something I needed to embrace. I've always been raised in like middle class America. You know, I've always been, you know, privileged. I'll use the word privilege in parentheses because I did grow up in a home that had my mom and my dad. I didn't struggle. And so people perceive me in a different category than some African Americans, and that's not exactly accurate, but I think that speaks to the dominant culture and what the visualization is of people. So I think all of these together, the historical context and the cultural context, really impact students. And I think ultimately, if we don't have this foundational information, we are unfortunately not helping our students in understanding where they fit into the larger scale of things. And so again, this is kind of one of my big talking points in my papers, really talking about how these cultures intersect with each other, and then understanding your own positionality within those different cultures. Through all of this, obviously identities are formed. An intrinsic identity would be something like the African American culture. It is who I am. It's embedded in me. That is where I come from. The extrinsic would be like the Black culture, right? That's what we see on TV. This is what Black people do. This is what they are. This is how they celebrate. This is how they talk. All of those things impact identities. I think the other part of this that really focuses on students is being able to identify with classmates. I recently, probably like 2 hours ago, watched a video of one of my friends who has a biracial child, and she showed a video, and there was like 100 students in the room, and she couldn't find her son. Well, her son was in a small group in the back with people that looked like him. And in the video, she's like, "Why are you back here?" And he said, "I wanted to be around people that looked like me." And I think that specific thing right there kind of hit home with everything that I'm kind of talking about today. And I feel like that's how sometimes students feel. in the aspect of not knowing really where they fall, or not knowing if people understand where they come from, or not understanding, you know, how different people see things, because I'm viewing things through a certain lens and somebody else might be dealing with that differently. And then obviously what goes with that is just developing through those social environments, right? Like, what are these conversations about? I said before, my friends and I go back and forth about the African-American culture and Black culture. Obviously, being a researcher, I always like want to pull up articles and bring, you know, prove my facts and show my statistics and all of these things. But I think the reality is it doesn't really matter where either one of us fall. It matters that we're having the conversation and that all of us have a different perspective and we're all okay with the other person's perspective. And I think that's kind of what gets lost, is we don't have to agree. We just have to understand where the other one's coming from, and then understand how to equate that into further conversation, or try to figure out, you know, what that looks like. I think the other, you know, big elephant in the room, as you will, is always the media impact on higher education. I have some words here that should, yeah. So poverty, I'm one of those people, I like to consider myself open-minded. I will watch any news channel, any news station about anything, whether it's in America, Germany, Russia, China, I don't care. I always want to know what's going on. One of the words, and I talk about this very heavily in my paper, is the word poverty is always associated with Black or brown people. A lot of times I don't hear or see, you know, a news break or something happens, and then it's a different type of group come in and they start talking about poverty. So I think even just that association of that word is already tailored to a group of, you know, Black and brown people, which impacts things. And I think, again, when you're on college campus and you're in a class and you're in, you know, government or sociology or psychology, and you're talking about all these different things, all of these words trigger different people. And I think as educators, that's something that we should be aware of, that we're not always aware of. An example for this is, I work in talent acquisition, and a big push for us right now is to try to get more diverse candidates to apply to roles. I work at a tech company. It's very dominantly male, and we're trying to figure out the correct wording to have on job descriptions to where we can actually have a diverse group of people apply. And what we found, because I did a study, is the wording. The wording on our job descriptions sound very masculine. We have words like, you know, be strong, lead ferociously. Like, we just have very like dominant, strong words. And I laughed and I thought it's very similar to when you're in a class and your teacher says something and you're like, ooh, I'm feeling a certain type of way, but I don't know how to, you know, react to how I'm feeling. I think, you know, poverty is one of those words. I think another word that comes to mind is Chicago. I don't know about any of you, I've been to Chicago on several times, but when I watch the news, you would think the only thing that happens in Chicago, if the Bulls aren't playing, if the Blackhawks aren't winning in hockey, or, you know, the Cubs aren't winning championships, that the only thing that happens there are shootings and people are dying. But again, the video that it shows of the people dying and all these things, it always shows Black and brown people. So that, just that little image impacts people. I think in my paper, I have a study where they actually surveyed 412 Chinese students that don't even live in the United States of America. And 82% of them, I think is what it says here. After they showed them a video, and they, I can't find it right now, but they basically showed him a video. And then after the video, they talked about, you know, who do you think was the aggressive one? Who do you think would be subject to poverty? Who do you think? And basically threw out all of these words. And of course, I think 82% of them picked, you know, Black or brown people, because that is what they saw. And it was a news report of what they were seeing, and they had to watch the news, I think, for 30 minutes. And then after the 30 minutes, and they talked about what they saw. And then 2 weeks later, they came back again, and they still had those same images, and they still had similar conversations than what they had. I think the other part of this is uppity. So I've been called uppity my entire life. just because, like I said, I come from a middle-class family, and so that terminology means, I guess it's supposed to mean a negative connotation. Michelle Obama was actually called uppity, I think 2 or 3 years ago. Not because she did anything, not because she was anywhere. She was just on stage setting, and one of the people commented that she was sitting there like an uppity first lady. So again, if you're hearing that on the media, and then you're coming to work and you're seeing somebody that's similar like Michelle Obama, or you're going to a classroom and you're seeing someone that's similar to her, all of these things are really shaping our view, and I think it's important to kind of bring that out. Obviously kneeling, obviously at this point, I went into my sister's classroom. I did a presentation there just about, they had like a career day, and I went in there and I presented, and I threw out some words and I said, you know, what do you guys think about kneeling? And everyone was like, Colin Kaepernick, Colin Kaepernick. And it's interesting to me because a lot of people, you know, kneel to pray. A lot of people, you know, kneel in working out. A lot of soldiers kneel if somebody gets hurt. But just now, the media has portrayed kneeling being a Colin Kaepernick word. So again, it's just kind of a play on words and how people are seeing things, and all of these things are impacting the Black and brown people that we have in our classrooms. And I think, you know, to not mention those things or to not realize the impact is not really helping the situation. Obviously, Black Lives Matter is here. A lot of people think Black Lives Matter is meaning Black Lives Matter and nobody else's lives matter. Again, that's not the message. The message is we matter too. However, the media has made it about only Black people caring about Black people, and I think when you do that, again, the message gets construed a little bit. This is actually an interesting thing too, because I actually had a student in one of my classes write a paper and totally bash Black Lives Matter. And again, being a Black professor, reading that, I had to make a decision. Am I going to read this and grade the student on how I actually feel about this topic? Or am I just going to grade this as a paper and kind of read through and go through with it? Luckily, it was a paper. I can handle myself just fine. But what if that would have been on a discussion post? You know, do you step in? Do you say something? And as a professor, how do I handle that? Obviously, me being Black comes with a different type of how I would deal with that. But what if that was, you know, a different person dealing with that? Again, all of these things are being played out in the media, and so that's why it matters. Gun violence, same thing as the rest of these words. I think all of these words have an impact. Protest, obviously the same as kneeling. I think the interesting thing about protest is like, what, in like 1930 or something like that, protest actually started for everything. Protesting wars, protesting women's rights, protesting, you know, gay marriage, protesting this, that, or the other. Like, protesting is a thing of this country. However, now the word protest often gets thrown in with Black and brown people, and I just think even that throws off things. And then the last one is working class. I don't know how much of you are into politics, and I don't want to go into politics. It's not the point of this, but just the word working class. Even if you Google working class, it comes up as like minorities, but if you actually research the numbers on the working class, it's actually not minorities, and that is actually false. But the media portrays it to be a certain thing, and so that's here. And the very last thing that's on here is something I actually found on Twitter this morning. And it's just a video I thought visually that kind of orchestrated what people see, and this actually speaks to that study that I was mentioning with the Chinese students. This actually also illustrates another study that happened at a university where it was the Opportunity Agenda group, and they did another research thing to talk about stereotypes and what do the stereotypes look like. And so again, this picture really depicted everything I'm kind of saying, is that depending on when you fall on the coin, you see things differently. And I think the moral of the story is we have to understand what we see and how other people are interpreting what we see, because we're in the positions to have these conversations and to make people feel comfortable, or to just understand what somebody is going through. So I think that's very important that we talk about that and realize that, you know, we are a part of that. And then obviously, you know, the bigger picture of all of this, right, is the responsibility of the system itself. The systematic impact as far as like how policies are made, who's sitting at the table, who gets accepted into certain schools. And then the other side of that, the climate of campuses. What kind of organizations do you have? Is there diversity with your professors? What about your assignments? The thing that pops out to me the most about assignments is I remember one of my fondest memories of being a child. I think it was like in first grade. And I remember one of the questions said, on a farm, something about horsing and feeding or something like that. And that analogy, I had no idea what was even going on. And I looked, and I remember my classmate, she was from a farm, and she was like, oh my God, this is simple. This is like the chickens, and da-da-da. And I thought, how am I, like, that just blew me away. And so just little things like that that probably don't mean anything, but actually have a different meaning depending on who's reading it. I think one of the classes I teach, one of the curricula or one of the choices for papers that you choose to write, depending on how you read one of the topics, you could see that topic as a completely racist thing, or you could see the topic as a not racist thing. Again, depends on your positionality. And obviously, it's just an oversight. I don't think anybody making that decision ever was like, this would kind of be seen, you know, awkward. But it's something that we should think about because it does put our students in weird positions. And then obviously they're forced to turn in stuff to their professor who they assume, you know, knows, you know, their perspective and stuff. So I think just being aware of all of these things matters. And then obviously the forums and the speakers. I remember when I was getting my PhD, all I wanted was to have one forum, one experience, one something where I could have somebody stand up and talk that looked like me. And I did my PhD program in 3 years. Those whole 3 years, I never got that opportunity to actually hear somebody talk that represented a group that I felt like I represented. And so that impacted me a lot. And if somebody asked me, you know, hey, did you like the school you went to? Well, yeah, I liked it. However, let's kind of talk about the things that I didn't see. And it might impact somebody's decision to go there. Who knows? But I think just the bigger picture is that it just didn't happen. And then obviously, you know, in my paper, I talk about what does all this look like? What does it mean? Just embracing the differences, being an ally. I think we're at a unique situation that we get to see so many diverse groups from different races, different, you know, cultures, different work history, different life experiences, grandmas, not grandmas, first-time students. But I think collectively, African Americans go through an interesting type of dynamic. And so it's just important to be aware of that. I think the biggest complaint I always get from other people when they're hearing this, they always say, why do Black people make this such a big deal? Like, why is this such a big deal? The reality is it's not a big deal. It's just something that it's nice to be aware of and know that this is happening and understand how those things impact somebody that you could be talking to. In my personal opinion, would make the world a difference. And that's kind of the conclusion of my paper is like, there's so much research out here about like, oh, you know, how can we, you know, understand, you know, African American students? How can we get them involved? How can we do that? The reality is none of that matters. You know, understand where people are coming from. It's not about like getting us involved. It's about listening to us and talking to us and trying to figure out what we go through and where we're coming from in our perspective. So I think that is, yep, that is my last slide. So yeah, I'll take any questions or comments that you guys have. You know, I'm open to listening and hearing, you know, any opinions or anything that you all think, or maybe something that I haven't, you know, said or that you have been thinking about when you saw the title for the presentation.
Awesome presentation, TaNeisha. If you do have questions, and I see some popping up right now, feel free to post them in the chat, and then we can address them.
I can't see them, Ryan. Do you mind reading them to me?
Okay. We got one. No problem. We got one request that if, you know, your paper is out on the internet somewhere, if you could just share the link to that. And let's see, we got another question here.
So just to answer that, I sent an email last night to see when it was going to be out published. I signed my contract and everything, so I don't know what the date is, but once I know that, I will definitely post it this is going to sound really ridiculous, but if you Google my name, the last one, I published something in their book, I think a year or two ago. It wasn't about this type, it wasn't the same thing, but it was something similar. And I'm in their book of articles as well.
We have another question that came in. It's a little bit more lengthy. It asks, can you talk a bit more about how you graded the anti-Black Lives Matter paper? Do you believe that African American faculty or faculty of color have a specific responsibility to educate learners who may hold prejudicial or uninformed views about race? Do all faculty share the same responsibility, or do you feel that faculty need to hold themselves apart?
So that's a really good question. And I'm going to be very honest with you. I think that it was one of probably my hardest moments in teaching, where I thought I have an opportunity here. I can actually educate the student and provide them resources to persuade their opinion. However, I have a strong rule in my class when I'm grading that I will never grade somebody against their argument if they make a good argument. And so for me, I legitimately read through. I made sure their sources were, scholarly sources, and I graded their paper just like I would grade anybody else's paper. And to be honest, after I submitted that grade, I felt like I was a disappointment because I missed that opportunity. But I also don't feel like it was the time, because I think the purpose of the paper, they mastered the purpose of the paper. And it wasn't about if I agreed or disagreed. I think being a Black, person in education, do I feel like I have a certain type of measurement? I think yes and no. I think it depends on the opportunity. I don't think the paper was the right time, but if that would have maybe happened in a discussion, maybe. I also have a philosophy in my class. Sometimes if I see students posting something that I feel like I need to talk to them offline, I've emailed and I've been like, hey, can we just have a quick conversation? I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're posting and that I'm viewing it the same way that you're viewing it. I definitely do feel like we have a responsibility to reach out to our students and make sure that we're on the same page as them, and that we're interpreting what they're saying important, and that we're educating them on how what they're saying could impact others. But ultimately, this is college, you can have your own opinion. It's just a matter of making sure that you don't cross the line into being offensive due to your opinion. So it's a double-edged answer. It's an answer that I feel like my dad would give me, and just saying, do I have an obligation? Yes, but I need to pick my spots, and my spot is not always when I want it to be. I hope that answered that question.
We just have a few moments left. If anybody else had any additional questions, again, just feel free to type them into the chat.
And I think if you have questions and you are, somebody that's in a position, and you are sitting there and you're thinking like, all of this relates to me, but I really don't want to speak up in front of this group of people, let me know. Send me an email, because I think that same thing that you're feeling right now, I think collectively we've all felt it. And I think even if we feel it, being people that can, freely come to these and attend to these and do all these great things. And I think there is a place for people who don't know when to speak out but have a ton to say. And that's what I hope this paper kind of brings out is, we're all in those spots. And sometimes you have a whole list of things you want to say, but you go back and forth with, is this the time, or should I wait, or should I take this offline? I think that's the basis of the paper, is understanding how students go through that as well.
I was going to say, I forgot that you can't see the chat, so I just typed in the chat. But I just said, I don't think you should have felt disappointed. I agree that the paper may not be the best time for a teachable moment on an issue unrelated to the assignment. That in and of itself could create a completely new problem. But I think what you did was a great example of what we ask our students to do every day, and that is really respecting diverse perspectives. So while you may not agree with what the person is saying, it shows that you can still assess them based on, did they meet the expectations as outlined in the assignment directions. So thank you.
Thanks for saying that.
Well, thank you so much, TaNeisha, for an excellent presentation, and thanks to everybody for joining this TLC session. Stay on for more excellent presentations. I hope you enjoy the rest of TLC.